Good morning. Welcome to the May board meeting. I have no apologies from board members this morning, but I do have apologies from Rebecca Sudworth, Director of Policy, and Rick Mumford, Deputy Director for Science. I've also want to give notice that if my internet does fail at any time, that Margaret Gilmore will take over from me in chairing the meeting. Do any board members have any conflicts of interest to declare?
Ruth, I think this is the first opportunity I've got to just register an interest, and that's that I've been appointed as the non-executive director of the Veterinary Medicines Directorate.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. And do any board members have any items of any other business that they wish to raise? No? Okay, thank you very much. Just to emphasise or to explain that this is an additional meeting which is outside our normal cycle, so the agenda is slightly different for this meeting. The reason for that is to make progress with our major reform programmes and especially to give adequate time for the local authorities to plan their work going forward after receiving the paper that we're discussing today. So the minutes of the March board meeting and the business committee meetings will follow the usual cycle, and they'll come to the June meeting as normal. And we'll also receive the report from the chair of ARAC at that meeting as well. So just to explain that. So we'll move on and we'll receive questions received in advance of the meeting today. And Justin Everard, Acting Director of Communications, is going to read out the questions for us. Justin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everybody. I have 5 questions that have been submitted in advance of this meeting. 4 questions are particularly pertinent to the papers in hand, and 1 question is about our broader remit. The first question comes from Peter Hewson. Peter is Veterinary Director of the Association of Independent Meat Suppliers, and he says, the FSA was set up to give independent advice on food safety and to monitor the delivery of official controls by other competent authorities. The agency took on the delivery of official controls in fresh meat premises as a cost-saving exercise by merging with the Meat Hygiene Service. In industry's view, that change of role, on which it was not consulted, was a mistake that led to the FSA focusing its limited resources on ante and post-mortem inspection, which according to the European Food Safety Authority adds little to food safety. Peter says, shouldn't the FSA, rather than embarking on yet another review of meat controls, concentrate on the roles given to it by Parliament and outsource inspection tasks at slaughterhouses to a delegated body or bodies? Such outsourcing is provided for by the regulations, unlike the agency's current use of a delivery partner, and would be more efficient as it would remove costs resulting from the duplication of management that is inherent in the current system. The second question comes from Justin Gleave-Badley, who is Environmental Health Technical Officer at Tendring District Council. Justin asks, the British Standards Institution, BSI, did over 110,000 remote audits last year. NSF did 35,000 in agriculture. If the FSA is committed to embracing digital technology, will it now commit to an evaluation timetable in order that awarding grades using remote can be part of the recovery programme? The third question, which is related to this as well, comes from Marion O'Neill. And Marion says, 307 local authorities have now declared a climate emergency. The local authority recovery plan requires local authorities to make physical on-site visits, the majority of which will likely require car journeys. Are there any circumstances where the FSA will allow them to undertake these visits remotely or even not at all? And please explain the rationale behind any decision. The fourth question is from Peter White, and Peter says, I write in respect of the FSA's most recent consultation on its codes of practice in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm interested in the difference in consultations in the countries and ask the board the following. Why 14 weeks was given to stakeholders in Wales to respond compared to 4 weeks in the other countries? I'm told Welsh local authorities were paid to respond. Were local authorities in the other countries also paid to respond? Why government guidance on consultations was not followed the same in each country? why were businesses who've been hard hit by the pandemic not supported to respond? And are the people of Wales seen as being more important than other countries to be given more opportunities, such as time and money, to respond? Peter says this is a real concern and brings into question the fairness of FSA's consultations. And the final question comes from Pamela Gardner. Pamela is a retired state-registered dietitian and a health promotion specialist. She says, I have a long-standing concern about legally undisclosed use in foods and drinks of isolated phenylamine, as in neotame, which is a derivative of aspartame, and in advantame, a mixture of aspartame and vanillin. Can you tell me, please, whether the FSA currently has any involvement in addressing the issue? And that is the end of the questions.
Thank you very much, Justin. So we will obviously attempt to address those where they're relevant to the agenda today as we go through the meeting. But all questions will receive a written answer as per usual. Thank you. I'm going to move to the Chair's report, and I'm very pleased to announce that the announcement of 2 new board members, Fiona Gately and Lord Blencathra, was made last Friday, and they join us as of the 1st of June. So they will be in attendance for our Board and Business Committee meeting on June 16th. And also to confirm the Health and Social Care Select Committee pre-appointment hearing of the preferred candidate for the FSA Chair, Professor Susan Jabb, is due to take place on the 8th of June. And subject to the committee's approval, we anticipate Sarah chairing her first board meeting in September. That's great news. My meetings will be noted in the June board meeting, but you will see that some joint meetings with the Chief Executive are recorded in Emily's paper next. Any questions? No? So we'll move on. Emily, to receive the Chief Executive report, please.
Thanks, Ruth. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. You have my report before you, but I just wanted to pick out a couple of areas to highlight. The report largely covers matters that are as a consequence of the UK leaving the EU. And I think it shows, as do the rest of the papers on the agenda, the extent of work that the Food Standards Agency has been undertaking over the last period. It's been, again, an exceptional period where a huge amount has been done. I'm very, very grateful to colleagues for all of their efforts. So just to pick out 4 areas. First of all, at paragraph 4 on regulated products, it says how many applications have been validated so far. We've had hundreds of applications. It's been far more significant than we expected. And we're in the process of going through those and validating the applications, making sure that they have the right material, that they're credible. And as we go through those, we will be publishing a list of validated applications on our website. Just to be clear, these are not yet authorised products. That process takes much longer, and we need to do a full safety assessment of the dossiers that applicants have given to us. But we will at least be able to show which applications have been validated as being credible. Secondly, at paragraph 9, I wanted to mention import controls. You can see a lot of work has been going on since the end of the transition period to make sure that imported food is checked, and all of the processes and systems that we've been gearing up with other parts of government have been operating. There have been a small number of imports that have come through Dover, which is not a recognised border control post for sanitary and phytosanitary products. So the correct checks have not taken place on those imports. As far as we are aware, and we have looked at this very closely, there has been no evidence of risk to animal or public health. And we consider this to be a business compliance issue. And we've been going proactively to importers to make sure that they follow the appropriate processes and don't take their sanitary and phytosanitary products issues through the Dover border control post. So thirdly, at paragraph 14, I just wanted to mention the concerns that we've been having about supply of veterinarians. There have been increased issues around recruitment and retention of vets with our service delivery partner, because since the end of the transition period, there's been a lot more work for vets. There's been more export health certificates, in particular, to authorise, which is done by the private sector. It means the market has been quite volatile. So we have taken the decision to offer some additional funding to our service delivery partner, and we're going to be keeping this under very close review over the next few months, given that, as I said, it's volatile and things may settle down a bit sooner. In addition, we're grateful that the language requirement for vets has been altered to level 5 rather than level 7, as we think this will also help temporarily with the recruitment and retention issue. And then finally, at paragraph 20, I just wanted to mention live bivalve molluscs and the FSA's role in relation to classifying seawater. In the light of the EU's position on the export of live bivalve molluscs to them, that they need to come from Class A waters. Since January, there's been a huge interest from the shellfish industry on the classification of waters to Class A. Previously, they had been keen to be in Class B or A, and obviously the shift has moved to Class A. So we've done a proactive review of the borderline Class B cases, especially in regard to seasonal classification, and have made a number of changes there. And I want to emphasise this is based on evidence and sampling, and is always with protecting public health in mind. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. So chance to ask some questions. Who'd like to go? Margaret, Colm and Mark. So Margaret first.
Emily, it's mind-boggling how much work that the FSA seem to be doing at the moment, and really impressive. So thank you for that. I've got a couple of questions, and then I've got a comment. Paragraph 17 on the shortage of official vets. Can I double check, is the extra monthly payment to the service provider, is it definitely a temporary move while the FSA assesses alternative resource models for the future? And were alternatives for this temporary solution considered? And then with reference to Dover, you just mentioned, I just wondered why Dover hadn't been chosen for those border checks. Is it a temporary thing? Because you'd have thought that actually for people importing, it would be one of the quickest and cheapest routes in from Europe. It probably isn't in our gift, I'm sure, but will there be checks there in future? And is there anything we can do to improve the situation? And then my comment is finally on allergens, just to say anecdotally, as a mother of someone who has got severe allergens, I've noticed a huge improvement in the way that restaurants in particular, but food businesses are handling allergens, and very noticeable. So anecdotal evidence to add to your much more scientific findings in the FSA study. And I do think that that's in part due to the campaigning around Natasha's law, but also the huge amount of extra work that the FSA has been doing in this area.
Thank you, Margaret. Should we take a couple more comments and then I'll come back to Emily? Colm, do you want to come next?
Sure, thank you. But I think my question was specifically around the paragraph 17 that Margaret has just raised in terms of the 136. I suppose my question was similar but slightly different. Do we expect what the 136 per month to run for the full year? Which is an additional cost of 1.6 million, and to what extent that we're not a big organisation, 1.6 million is not an immaterial part of our budget. To what extent is that fully budgeted for? And just the other question in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the horizon scanning looked at in paragraphs 12 and 13, we're probably starting to see some monies, and we'll come to this later on in the meeting today around the discussion on Operation Transformation, but we're starting to see minor divergences now, which are obviously having impacts as they pick up. So just be interested to see how that horizon scanning work is going. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Colm. Mark, we'll take yours and then we'll come back to Emily.
Thank you, Ruth. Just to echo what Margaret said about the breadth of work here, it is truly impressive. I do have quite a concern around the transit goods issue at Dover. As a man of Kent, I can tell you a lot about what's going on at Dover, but I won't. My concern here is just bearing in mind the sheer volume of food and feed which comes through Dover and the Channel Tunnel. How confident are we that the issues exposed with this incident are not more widespread? And accepting what you said, Emily, about the fact that there's no identified risk here and this appears to be probably the result of a technical error, are we confident that the right measures in place to prevent perhaps some who may have an unscrupulous intent, either in relation to transit goods or even in relation to non-compliant goods in the EU that need to be exported from the EU, are we confident the right measures are there to stop those people taking advantage of the current freedom at the short straits? I'd also be interested to know what your thoughts are on what an effective digital solution might look like in a space where it's all around the physical movement of real goods. And my other point quickly, if I may, is I've noted your paragraph about FSA and Capita's intentions in relation to FSA and the laboratory structure. Now that we can't rely on the reference and control laboratory infrastructure in the EU, could you perhaps give us your thoughts on what the potential impacts of this might be, and perhaps just a bit of reassurance that as the competent authority in this space, this issue does feature on our risk register and that it's got the appropriate mitigations assigned to it. Thank you, Ruth.
Excellent. Thank you for all the comments and questions. Emily, do you want to kick off and others may want to join in?
Yes, thank you very much. So let me start on the import control question, given that Mark mentioned it last. I'll say a couple of things and I'll also, after I finish speaking, I'll ask Colin to come in and add some supplementary information, as he's our director in the lead on this. So why is it possible for these goods? Why isn't Dover a designated border control post for these sorts of goods? So the goods are products of animal origin and high-risk food not of animal origin. It's because Dover is extremely tight for space. So you would need to have certain bays to move heavy goods vehicles into them to do the particular physical checks. There's a certain frequency of physical checks that are needed of these sorts of goods. And it's always been accepted that Dover didn't have the space for that to happen at the moment. And certainly in time for the end of the transition period, I think Border Force and others were just very clear it was never going to be possible. So if you're importing those goods, products of animal origin or high-risk food, it's meant to come through other ports like Felixstowe. And what would the digital solution be? Well, what we're looking for is for the HMRC system to automatically make it not possible for you to register those particular products on their system, so it wouldn't be possible to come through Dover. But actually to make that digital solution work is some effort. So in the meantime, we need to be getting in touch with importers and making sure that they're not bringing their products through Dover. As I said in the report, we think it's only about 55 importers who've been doing it. And about 20 of those do about 90% of the product. So we're pretty confident we've been in touch there, and Colin can say more about the data that we've checked to ensure that we have a comprehensive view. Just to then pick up the questions about our service delivery partner and the additional payments. So were alternatives considered? I think that one of the things to register is that we have a 3-year contract with Evelyn Jones and our service delivery partner, which was signed end of March last year. So it started in April last year. So we are in that arrangement for 3 years. We obviously thought very hard about what the right level was and had a number of negotiations with them about that. I'm very clear that whilst we've made the provision for a maximum of 12 months, we're going to keep it under very close review for the period. And to answer Colin's question about whether we've budgeted for it, it is an additional unexpected pressure, but fortunately we were aware of it in February, so we've put that into our budgeting this year and haven't had to move other budgets around as a consequence because we were able to foresee it early. But yes, it isn't. We're confident we can pay for that in budget, but we've just had to think through a number of other issues, and obviously some of that will be passed on to those who benefit from the service because we do charge, and so there is some additional cost to food business operators. And then on the reference control laboratories point from Mark. So I having talked to FSA, I'm not concerned at the moment about the resilience of the network and whether we're going to lose access to particular sorts of checks. It's a slow burn process, what's going on there, and I feel reasonably confident that we will continue to benefit from their service. But I'll ask Julie to talk about the way that we look at the question of laboratory capacity, and we are doing some deeper, longer term thinking about what the right arrangements are there. And of course, we'll be bringing that up in our spending review bid in the autumn. But Julie can say a bit more. So perhaps I could hand over to Colin first.
Thank you very much, Emily. Colin.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning. So in relation to Dover, as Emily has highlighted, there are capacity issues in terms of the space in Dover. Dover is a designated port for a number of high-risk foods not of animal origin, but not for the wider range of high-risk foods not of animal origin, nor for products of animal origin. There are proposals and plans afoot to develop a water control post at White Cliffs, adjacent to Dover, so that's a longer term plan. The goods that are transited through the EU to Great Britain require checks, and therefore they shouldn't be brought through Dover. In the longer term, there will be checks on goods coming from the EU, and hence the White Cliffs development. So we have been tracking the goods that have been coming that haven't been pre-notified and have come through Dover. We have contacted all the importers involved and highlighted that their goods are non-compliant, and therefore the bulk of those goods are now coming through other ports, Felixstowe in the main. So we have dealt with the initial issue in largely, although we continue to track the data and continue, and I suppose we're in a sort of law of diminishing returns, where having spoken to importers, the numbers of consignments coming through Dover are now reducing significantly. And then the longer term solution is to, as Emily has highlighted, is also being progressed as well. Could I also then move on to the issue around the service delivery partner? And Margaret had asked the steps that we'd taken. So in relation to that, we commissioned within the agency a task and finish group with a range of different inputs from across the agency. We also commissioned a pay specialist as advisor, and we looked at the options of not providing additional resources, or the option of providing additional resources for the remainder of the life of the contract. And we struck upon a bespoke approach, which is that we're reviewing the requirement with a notice to E&J of 2 months. So there isn't an automatic assumption, Colin, that we would be paying this for a year. That may be necessary. We don't know. We are reviewing it. And I suppose this arises because of a pool of veterinarians away from this area of business to other opportunities. We're conscious that this hit us initially in January with the end of the transition period. There are other hurdles that we need to get over. We have the end of the grace period, the extended grace period, starting from for Northern Ireland, starting from the 1st of October. And we have the introduction of import controls into Great Britain at the beginning of next year. So those are other hurdles we need to be alive to. So that's the approach that we've adopted.
Thank you very much, Colin. Colin wants to come back in. Is it on this issue, Colin?
It is, yeah. Well, just quickly, Chair, and to give some further assurance to the board, I've been speaking to Chris and looking at the E&J contract. So there's a piece of, if you like, a deep dive piece of work being done there to get a better understanding around all of that. And the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee will consider that probably over the course of late summer. And part of that will be a future look. So we do need to get our heads around this, because I think this is becoming an increasingly complex area for the agency. But just to give that assurance to the board that IRAC have this in hand with Chris and the finance team.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Julie, you're going to come in on the lab issue?
Yes, that's right. Thank you. Picking up on the FSA question, please be reassured that we do have close working relationships with FSA. So we're monitoring as far as we can where they're going, where their plans actually are, and we're considering any remedial action that we might need to take. Also, Emily touched on our longer term plans where we're looking at the laboratory provision overall. So we've got a more strategic piece of work, considering what our requirements are in the medium to longer term. And key to that is resilience of the provision of that set of services. So all of that is under consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily, you want to come back in? Just first of all, Robin, was it on the same point?
It was, Ruth. Yeah, just briefly, if I may, on the labs, it might be useful to the board to that firstly that I sit on the FSA Science Committee, so there's quite a good link there as well. And also we're very open and interested in sharing best practice, both nationally and internationally. And in fact, there's a series of meetings that we have, the first of which is next week with colleagues overseas, in this case in the Netherlands, to kind of learn about lab capacity and better ways of doing things. So I'll obviously update the board on that in due course, but there's lots of active discussions in that arena. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Emily.
Thanks. Yes, I just was conscious I hadn't responded to Colm's question about Northern Ireland, so I wanted to pick that up. Just you asked about our horizon scanning and our awareness of EU developments and making sure we were conscious where things were diverging. As far as I'm concerned, our facility to do that is working well. We have a team in our policy directorate that keep a close eye on what's going on with EU food and feed developments. So, for example, as I've reported in the CEO's report, the European Food Safety Authority has just published its own risk assessment about titanium dioxide. So we now have clocked that and have commissioned our own risk assessment to see what we think of the evidence. So that's a good example. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emily. So any more questions to Emily on her report? Just scanning? No, I don't think so. Well, thank you very much, Emily, for that comprehensive report. So we'll move on to our first strategic paper, and that's the Local Authority Recovery Map. And to welcome Michael Jackson to the meeting as Head of Regulatory Compliance. And Maria, I think you're going to kick off and introduce the paper.
Thank you, Ruth. Just to say a few words by way of introduction. There are three key issues that we want the board to discuss and give their guidance on today. The recovery plan itself, how we monitor then the local authority performance this year and next year, and then also how we intend to support local authorities as they put this plan into action. This recovery plan replaces the current advice that we have. We've given local authorities, and that advice is to prioritise their interventions. And we really want to shift the focus now to restarting the intervention programme by focusing on high risk and new businesses. And we really believe that this will provide a higher level of protection for consumers and also will address non-compliance within the food safety system. We also want to signal very clearly that we have a longer term direction of travel here, where we want to review our current hygiene delivery model and place a greater emphasis on non-compliant businesses and high-risk businesses. Just to reassure the board, we've worked very closely with local authority liaison groups over the last couple of months across the 3 countries. And the feedback that we have received has been addressed within this paper and also will be covered in more detail in the detailed guidance that we will accompany this plan. You will see in the board paper that we have made a number of assumptions, and those assumptions obviously are what we believe to be the case now, but will need to be kept under review if our operating environment changes to any great extent. With your permission, Ruth, I would like to ask Michael to come in to outline the key aspects of the paper.
Thanks, Maria. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Ruth. Good morning, everyone. If I could just start by building on what Maria has said, we have very clear objectives around this delivery plan. And it's about ensuring that local authorities return the diverted resources back to the food teams, and that they can identify and focus on those businesses that are trading. The plan will take local authorities back to conducting inspections on the basis of what is currently in the Food Law Code of Practice. So once an intervention happens, the system starts to roll forward again. And it's very much about prioritising those businesses that pose the greatest risk to public health and consumer protection. Similarly, we recognise that risk may have changed over the course of the pandemic. So we expect local authorities to react to information and intelligence that suggests that the risk is now greater, and they will not be constrained by the risk categories that businesses are in based on when they were last inspected before the pandemic kicked in. And overall, activity here will protect consumers, it will improve hygiene and standards, compliance, and it will lead to a more routine operation of the food hygiene rating scheme, which is very good news for consumers. Turning then quickly to the plan, we have 2 phases, and the first phase runs from July to September. And this very much recognises the environment that local authorities are currently operating in, where there is much effort required in relation to those businesses that are reopening in the hospitality sector, and they need to prepare and organise for routine planned interventions in phase 2. One point I would like to make clear to the board is that although this is forward-looking to a restart of the system, we know from our engagement with local authorities that many are already starting to conduct planned interventions, so they're not hanging back waiting for this advice to be issued. We know they're doing the right thing where resources permit. The plan is underpinned by a number of principles and factors. Those are detailed in the paper. But ultimately, what the plan does is provides a framework that takes into account the fact that every local authority is starting from a different place in terms of the resources available to them and the particular challenges they face at the local level. In terms of the detail of the plan, one thing I would like to emphasise is that the timelines for achieving the milestones in the plan, as detailed in Annex C, are what we consider to be the maximum acceptable. Where resources permit local authorities to go faster in restarting and getting through the risk categories, we expect them to do so. And we will emphasise this in the Q&A document that will accompany the plan. In terms of the challenge that's faced, we have recently had the returns from local authorities for 2021. This was a bespoke return for this year that was designed to capture the impact of the pandemic on their activities and establish the current lie of the land with resources. We've had a very good response rate. Local authorities were positive about the specific report we made available this year and the ease with which it could be completed. In England, we have a 98% return rate at the moment, and in Wales and Northern Ireland, it's 100%. And from our initial analysis, we can see that in Northern Ireland, 19% of the resource that would normally be dedicated to the food service for food hygiene and 14% for food standards is still on COVID. So a significant level of resource has returned in that country. However, if we look at England, we can see that 55% of resource is still for food hygiene is still on COVID and 43% for food standards. And finally, for Wales, where local authorities have played a very comprehensive role in the wider control of the pandemic in partnership with the public health bodies in Wales, we can see that some 66% of food hygiene resource and 62% of food standards resource is still on COVID. And those figures relate to the 31st of March, which was the timeline for the return. So what we can see is everybody's starting from a different place. We've given a structure which sets out the approach, and that gives us a framework that will help us to manage risk as best as possible. As Maria mentioned, we did consult widely with local authorities through established fora, both at officer level and also at chief executive level through the current MHCLG working groups. And we did get support for the proposal. There was a recognition that it is a very difficult challenge to produce a plan that everyone can work within to achieve the objectives, not least because everyone is starting from a different place. but it was recognised that in terms of how we have put this together, trying to keep it as simple as possible, but providing a structure that would enable the system to start working again, that this seemed measured. Many local authorities feel that it will be very challenging, particularly those where they still have a significant level of resource diverted. But all were confident that they could rise to this challenge and move to get the system working as quickly as possible. We did receive some feedback around what were perceived to be gaps in the recovery plan. So, for example, in relation to food standards, in terms of the initial proposal, it did not recognise or take account of the fact of changing requirements in relation to the new legislation on pre-pack for direct sale, which will apply from October. And we have amended the food standards expectations to make it clear that irrespective of the risk category, if the local authority believes that the business would be impacted by this new requirement, then an intervention should be conducted. So clearly this is an example where changing risk or new information overrides the planned intervention programme to make sure that we're always targeting risk in the best way. In terms of monitoring the plan, you'll see at paragraphs 327 to 331 that we plan to take a number of measures to make sure that local authorities are progressing as we have identified. This will start by our detailed analysis of the 2021 returns to identify those local authorities where there are very serious issues around resource being returned to the food service. And we will engage with the local authorities to discuss what steps they're taking to address that. We'll continue to engage through our participation in local food liaison groups to establish the picture around all three countries. And we're going to analyse data from the FHRS database to monitor how individual local authorities are progressing with inspections of new businesses, so awaiting inspection levels come down, and also the volume of new ratings being issued. And as during the pandemic, where local authorities are not able to meet our expectations, we would expect them to tell us so that we can engage and figure out what we can do to help support them. On the issue of support, we are aware that one of the biggest challenges for local authorities is establishing which businesses are now actually trading. There having been many that registered as new, possibly because people who work in the hospitality sector were on furlough, saw an opportunity, others which just have passed their natural lifespan. And having listened to the concerns from local authorities, we do want to look at developing tools and helping them to be able to identify businesses that are trading, and hopefully also to use artificial intelligence to help predict an FHRS score. And this would enable them then to target the resources to where the greatest risk would be, recognising that for some local authorities, they have a large number of registered businesses that have not yet had an inspection. So at that point, Chair, I'll stop and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Maria. Obviously, we absolutely appreciate the efforts that local authority officers have made in support of the COVID response at local level. But this paper does set out the importance of now shifting the focus back onto the food hygiene system, the food standard system. So a really important proposal going forward. Now I've got Tim, Mark and Colm. So Tim first.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks for the report. I mean, I think it's a particularly difficult time for local authorities. Not only have they got trading changes, a backlog, reprioritising, but they've also got to look at a new, more dispersed market, often smaller, often more dynamic. And I guess that does raise changes, both what we do now and what happens strategically. I guess I was interested in just understanding better where resource implications raised in the report might impact back on what we as the FSA do, and are there knock-on resource implications for us that we need to accommodate, and also about what communications we have around the food hygiene reporting scheme, so that we can still reasonably assure the public of the safety of the food that they buy and of the premises they buy it from. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. You take Mark.
Thanks, Ruth. I just want to say I've got a number of observations here, but I just want to say I think this is a really impressive and welcome piece of work. And Mike, I'd like to commend you and your team for it, if I may. I'm sure there'll be a few in local authorities who take issues with some aspects of it, but I think the clarity that FSA have set out their expectations, our expectations, both during and now in recovery from the pandemic, is really good practice, and I think it should be seen as such. In terms of observations, there's lots of reference in this roadmap to interventions, and that's right and proper. But there's also some other really important things in here, and I hope they don't get lost in the drive for interventions. One in particular that I wanted to draw out is the encouragement around proactive surveillance. The issue with intelligence-led systems is that they tend to lead you back to the same things that you already know about, the things that are on the radar. And the proactive surveillance is an absolutely vital tool in seeing the things which are perhaps less visible and therefore managing to attract resources to those before they become a major issue. So I think that's really important, and I really welcome the fact that it's in there. The encouragement, I think, and Tim touched on this as well, to carry out as many hygiene rating visits as possible, I think is really important too. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that there is, as well as this being a really important tool for food safety, it's actually a really important tool for competition in local markets as well. And there's little incentive for a business to improve their standards if they can't get the recognition of that with an uprated hygiene rating simply because of a capacity issue with the local authority to visit. So again, I think it's really important that we see that there. There is, I see this sort of recognition in here at 3.12 around the various competing influences on local authorities. And again, Tim's touched on that. It is important local authorities are being pulled in a number of directions. And I just suppose looking for a little bit of insurance there that we're confident that the support we're giving to local authorities to understand and balance those competing influences is all that we can be doing. I get from the report that I think it is, but just seeking a little bit of reassurance there. And my last point really is around the monitoring of the plan. I think it's really important that we do monitor the plan. The report sets out our structures for escalating issues of concern, which is right and proper. But I'm interested to know whether we have a similar system perhaps for raising a situation with a local authority who are performing well and who are doing everything that we expect of them. That kind of recognition can be really helpful for service managers when they're seeking to attract local resources into this space. Thank you, Ruth.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We've got a number more questions. Perhaps if we take the first two, and then I'll come back to Colin, Margaret, and Peter.
Thanks, Ruth. If I could just respond firstly to Tim's question. In terms of resource implications for the FSA, we in normal pre-COVID times have a team that is responsible for what local authority monitoring of performance and then undertaking management activities where there are concerns. So in essence, we have a resource there that will, instead of focusing what they would do in a routine world pre-pandemic, they will focus on this particular work. So it doesn't drive an additional resource need for us. In terms then of the FHRS side of things, whilst there will be certain businesses by virtue of being very low risk and very compliant that will not be top of the priority list, what we do know is that in terms of the businesses that will be prioritized for inspections, those are the ones where FHRS is of the most value to consumers. So takeaways, restaurants, hotels, those are the types of places where we know consumers are more inclined to take the FHRS into account. So this approach actually works well in terms of that wider objective in relation to the food hygiene rating scheme. Turning then to Mark's points, very important what you said, Mark, around proactive surveillance. One of the issues that has arisen through the engagement with local authorities is understanding exactly what we mean about proactive surveillance, what the expectation is. And we intend to clarify that in some detail in the Q&A so that they understand that they must be maintaining this activity to identify where there is changing risk and then prioritise those businesses. In terms of the support for local authorities, we have outlined some initial work that we're doing. We're looking at some other potential things that we could do. We're not making assumptions about what we think would help, but we're actually still having discussions with, for example, the national focus groups to get ideas from them. So this is not the totality of the assistance that we'll provide. There will be more as we identify exactly what would be helpful and add value. On the point of the regime recognising those that are performing well, clearly, we will be coming back to the board in due course, both later this year in relation to the 2021 analysis, and then for subsequent years. Within that, we will look to provide a balanced view around where we had concerns and where performance was deemed to be good in terms of our expectations. So we'll definitely bear that in mind for future reporting to the board and engaging with local authorities.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, so we'll come to Colin, then Mark and Peter. Colin.
Sure, thank you very much. And can I also compliment Maria, Michael and the team on excellent paper and very, very clear. Some concerns, particularly in terms of the percentages of food-related staff not returned to those duties across the three nations. Northern Ireland, apparently tremendous performance, does mask the fact that Northern Ireland local authorities have not got the same range of responsibilities as those in England and Wales. So let's not, so 19 looks brilliant, but it's probably masks a little bit about, we are brilliant in Northern Ireland anyway, as people know, but there's a little bit more to that. And I suppose the question is, how concerned should we be about the fact that we're north of 50% of those who should be in this area not returned yet? The one theme that will run through all of today's discussions on the transformation agenda is resource in various partners and so forth. And I think that is going to be a common theme. And it's the extent to which we're able to get that resource, because we are aware of the difficulty in qualified EHOs. And we had a discussion on this at NIFAC last week with some members of the Northern Ireland Food Managers Group from two local authorities. And they were actually concerned with registration, even though we've got some qualified EHOs, they're not fully registered yet. So there are a couple of bottlenecks there. How much are we able to do with local authorities in terms of getting the competencies right rather than necessarily the university qualification? So in other words, are we able to get the skills right to do the job and move up that curve a little quicker? And then the final 2 points I'd make on the two-phase plan. It strikes me we have one very short phase, which is only 4 months to run. And so and given the continued level of uncertainty, for example, in Northern Ireland, we have only literally Monday of this week opened the hospitality sector again, so there was nothing to inspect in Northern Ireland until this week. So we're a little behind other parts of the UK. And I am conscious of some of the difficulties in certain parts of England, particularly with COVID. So have we got sufficient flexibility built into that? We've got a very short-term phase one, quite a long-term phase two, and that brings me to the sort of the final point, and this came strong from the Food Manager Group representatives in Belfast last week. It must be clear that these are the minimum standards we're hoping to achieve through this plan, not the maximum. And while the food managers are of the view that they are certainly in Northern totally committed to doing that, it's not them you've got to convince. It's the chief executives of local council. And you did, Michael, in your presentation reference those discussions. How big an issue is this? And is it as big an issue as it needs to be at chief executive level and local authority. I think the food managers are on board. I think they will do and will want to do what they need to do, but they're going to need, particularly in Wales, they're going to need that support from the top of their local authorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Com, and very much endorse that this is a minimum approach. And for those who can go faster, we definitely want them to do so and get that message out. Margaret, next.
Thank you. And yeah, this is a huge task, and so I have my thanks to Maria and Michael and your teams for what you're doing, but also to the LAs who are clearly on the tightest of resource levels. And so adding to what colleagues have said, how realistic are we being that the LAs can actually get back to, in the short term, to the increased workload that we need for them to catch up? On top of that, I know that the law insists to a great extent on face-to-face inspections, but I wondered how much evidence there is now that more remote inspections that were used to a certain extent during COVID may be one of the solutions that could help ease resources and be just as efficient where businesses are not high risk. And I know there are stakeholders who've been in touch with you, and there was a sort of question leading up to that at the beginning of this board meeting. So I just wondered whether you were looking at that and evaluating how much this the use of remote inspections could actually help us here.
Thanks, Margaret. And we'll take the next point from Peter.
I'm very much reassured by looking at this plan that it is risk-based and tackles the complexity. And as Michael was pointing out, that local authorities are starting in a different place, and the various ones. And also, of course, there are differences between the three nations, and all of that adds to complexity. Now, the important thing, therefore, is to be very closely in touch with the local authorities in each of those nations and recognizing differences. And when the Welsh Advisory Committee had a look at this paper last week, they were encouraged by the degree of consultation which has already taken place. There were a couple of issues that came up where they were looking for greater clarity or greater support. And the first was on the greater support side about local authority training needs during this process and what exactly you had in mind there, because some emphasis was placed on that. And the other one was about consistency exercises to ensure a consistent approach as far as possible between England and Wales, but also within each of those nations, and how you see exercises to be able to monitor what is going on.
Thank you very much, Peter. So, Michael.
Thanks, Ruth. In terms of the concerns raised by Colm and Margaret around the levels of staff and that matching to the expectation, if we look at the current lie of the land and recognising that lockdown has eased at different rates in each of the three countries, and there are still certain pressures related to the variant. What we do anticipate is that looking at the wider activities which we know local authorities are engaged in, as we move through this first phase of the plan, it is reasonable to expect that further resource will come back. When the initial workload around hospitality reopening has been addressed, that will have a positive impact. And through our engagement with local authorities, we know that the food service managers are constantly doing their best to pull the resource back as and when any work eases back on the COVID front. They will also use the opportunity to address COVID issues as well as food safety in the hospitality sector, because quite often they'll want to determine compliance in relation to both. So there would be a synergy there. So whilst we do see quite a varied position in terms of resource, we do now have very good mechanisms across the 3 countries for engaging with local authorities on a regular basis to establish what is actually happening. And where we can see a lack of progress, or indeed, as per what our current expectation is, if local authorities are not meeting our expectations, they will be expected to notify us, and then we will engage with them to see how best we can support them. On the issue of competencies, we have in Northern Ireland and England introduced the new Food Law Code of Practice, and that introduced a different approach to competency and amended the baseline qualifications. So we do see that as helping to allow local authorities to be more flexible in terms of who they can employ and what they can use people for in terms of the various activities across the whole of the recovery plan. Colm is right, there is an underlying problem around the availability and flow of people into this area of work, primarily in environmental health, but also in trading standards. This is an issue which is now recognised across government, and we are participating in an MHCLG task and finish group that is looking at what we may be able to do across government to help improve this particular problem, understanding the barriers to people being able to progress into this profession and trying to unlock that. I think we've covered it a couple of times today, but the issue of this is the minimum expectation will be clearly emphasised. It isn't just about the interventions, it's about the range of activities that are described in the annex, and we won't just be asking about planned interventions. On Margaret's point around the use of remote assessment, we will be continuing to allow local authorities to use remote assessment as they have been through the pandemic. So there are certain scenarios where they can use any form of engaging off-site to inform what needs to happen whenever they're working off-site, whenever they go on-site. The whole issue of the role of remote assessment is one that has taken on a great degree of interest over the period of the pandemic. This impacts potentially not only on the local authority world, but also in relation to operations through the audit activities that are carried out by colleagues in that part of the business. And then we've got wider interest around the use of remote assessment in private assurance schemes that we recognise for the purposes of earned recognition and more globally at international level. What we intend to do is to consider this in the round. So we have established a working group just within the last week that will focus specifically on the role of remote assessment at all levels, in all spheres, how we can make the best use of that in such a way that we do not compromise the official control regime, particularly where, for example, inspections are supposed to be unannounced. And we will be providing further guidance to local authorities on that and looking to maximise the use of remote assessment where it's the right thing to do. Lastly, on Peter's point, training and consistency. We are currently in the process of reinvigorating our approach to local authority training and support across each of the countries. So that's very much on our radar. We will be looking at the actual gaps and the needs, not just making generic training available. And on consistency, we will continue to operate our FHRS consistency exercises that we run on a 3-country basis to be able to assess whether local authorities are being consistent in their assessment and rating of businesses. We did actually manage to run Exercise 5 during the pandemic and had a very good level of participation by local authorities. That demonstrated again that we have got to a good place in relation to consistency of scoring when it comes to intervention ratings and therefore FHRS, and we'll continue to build on that through another exercise this year.
Thank you very much, Michael. Margaret wants to come back in.
Just very briefly, I'm just relating back then, because you did generalise it, and I agree, it does go across actually nearly all the papers today. This idea of the remote audits. One of the questions from, I think it was Tendring District Council, was about an evaluation timetable. And I just wondered whether you had could give us an idea of how you were going to reply to that question.
So in relation to the use of remote assessment as described in the current guidance to local authorities, we have undertaken some evaluation of that already, and that report has been published. My colleagues in operations have also been evaluating the experience of trying to use it in the environment of slaughterhouses and cutting plants. We now need to establish what we see the future role being, start to get that into practice, and from there that would determine what the appropriate time would be to evaluate whether the expanded approach and use would actually be delivering what we want to achieve through the use of that approach.
Thank you. I think Julie wants to come back in.
Yes, thank you. Just building on this point about remote assessments, I think this is a great opportunity for us in the medium to long term. I know we haven't done the work yet, but I think we could consider it not to be a binary question. There may be valuable hybrids that sit in the middle that both give us greater insights, more frequent insights as to what's going on, and also taking pressure off resources. And that's certainly been some of the experience that we've had from other sectors, and particularly as Michael said, there's quite a lot of work going on internationally with this. So I think there's a building body of experience that we can bring to bear, and we will do. Thank you.
Yeah. Peter, you've got your hand up. Is that from before, or do you want to come back in?
Sorry, not lowered it.
That's all right. Thank you. Emily.
Just to add on this question of remote assessment, I think Julie's point about hybridity, to use a terrible word, is essential. There are some things that you have to be on site to check. So if you're wanting to do the sniff test, if you're wanting to spot whether there's been rodents, it's really hard to do that when someone's holding up a camera phone and taking you around. But there are other things that local authority officers have been doing through the pandemic, like phoning a business to check what kind of food they're selling and whether it's high risk or low risk, what their reach is, how many customers they might have, so that help them do that risk assessment. So I think it's really useful that we've done a bit of evaluation already. We have published that report very recently that Michael referred to, and I encourage people to have a look at it. And then the question about how we design this for the future is still a bit up for grabs.
Thank you. And Michael, just to confirm, on the local authority monitoring of delivery, are we aligning that work on performance with the local authority audit programme?
We will be looking specifically at the delivery against the expectations in the recovery plan from a performance monitoring and management perspective. My colleagues in audit are looking at what would add value in the current climate. Chris Hitchen may wish to comment on that one.
Okay, thanks. No, Chris? Yeah. Do you want to add any more, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, that's right. So the internal audit team have already put a proposal together, which I've been considering. It's yet to go through the executive management team because things are moving fairly quickly. I think, as Michael's rightly said, the challenge is that ordinarily the audit team would be reviewing the work of the local authorities, and because that work is going to be ramping up slowly over the period, we just need to make sure that we make best use of that audit resource.
Okay, thank you. Great. I don't think there are any more comments or questions. So just to confirm, we're being asked to consider and agree the recovery plan, consider and agree the proposals for monitoring local authority delivery during the recovery period, and consider and comment on the proposal to develop appropriate key performance indicators and a performance support and management strategy. And I think you've had general agreement with all of those, and also a real congratulations on the work you've done to get us to this point, and our huge thanks to local authorities to encourage them on the road to recovery of their functions. So thank you, everybody. Right, we'll move on to Achieving Business Compliance Programme. So welcome Carmel Linsky, Head of the ABC Programme, to the meeting. And Stephen Pollock, Director of Strategy, Legal, Governance, Communications, is going to introduce the paper. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. And yes, I'd like to introduce and welcome to the board Carmel Linsky, who took over as the head of the Achieving Business Compliance Programme in January this year. I was struck there by the discussion on the recovery plan and some phrases that I think capture the essence of what ABC is seeking to achieve: targeting risk in the most effective way, greater use of data, proactive surveillance, remote interventions, greater flexibility for compliant and low-risk food businesses, prioritising the highest risk businesses, and of course the pressure on local authorities. And how within the recovery there's the opportunity and the need for reform. So it's a really welcome introduction to this paper. We're asking the board today to consider the progress made on ABC, agree the reset direction of travel, including the work streams, and note the plan for delivery this year. It has been over a year since the last update was given to the board about ABC. As you know, during that time, we've prioritised our work in the FSA, dealing with the impact of the COVID pandemic and the end of the transition period as we left the European Union. So being honest, responding to those challenges has meant that progress on the programme hasn't been at the pace we would have wanted. That said, the paper sets out the work that's continued in the past year, particularly in analysing supporting evidence, building insight to underpin the case for change, shape the programme, and articulate our ambition. I think the case for change, which is rooted firmly in the drivers behind the Regulating Our Future programme, remains as strong as ever. That need to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to regulating food businesses, a regulating system that lacks agility and isn't keeping pace with technological changes in the industry, and that continued pressure on local authority resources. If anything, those challenges have been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic, the changes that that's brought in consumer behaviour and business operating models, how the pandemic's affected our local authority partners and put pressure on their resources even further. And those continued technological advances, the rapid growth in online activity, whether it be retail, takeaways and deliveries, online marketplaces, and with really big, significant global players like Amazon moving into the food space. But the programme is always also grounded firmly in our guiding principles, acting in the consumer interest, making it easy for businesses to do the right thing and comply with food law, and joint endeavour, working with local authority partners, business and others to deliver reforms and a regulatory framework that's fit for the future. So the ABC programme is now set back on track, beginning to make progress with revised and clearly defined work streams, supporting activities to deliver those work streams, and a new timetable for delivery. And I'd like to hand over to Carmel just to quickly take you through that in a bit more detail. Carmel, over to you.
Thank you, Carmel.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Ruth. So let me tell you a little bit about the programme structure and a bit about our focus for this year. As you can see from the paper, the programme really has been divided into 3 key work streams. So these reflect the outcomes, as Stephen said, that we're seeking to achieve, but they also speak to the evidence that we've gathered and that we've analysed. We are an evidence-led programme. The first work stream follows on from the paper you've just heard about from Michael Jackson and local authority recovery. This will really help us to move from recovery into reform as we seek to continue to build on the work that was started by the Regulating Our Future programme to develop a targeted and proportionate regulatory approach to all food businesses. During the next 12 months, we'll review the hygiene delivery model, and we'll also evaluate the food standards model pilots that are currently underway. And these will deliver multiple benefits for consumers, for local authorities, and for businesses. So that should include the development of a more sophisticated risk scoring mechanism, reduced regulatory burden for consistently compliant or low risk premises, and the integration of intelligence to the delivery of official controls. So in addition to that work stream, we have two new work streams that are new for Achieving Business Compliance programme. One is focused on assuring food sold online, and one is taking a fresh approach to regulating big businesses at an enterprise level, as opposed to that traditional bricks and mortar premise-based approach. But both these work streams really reflect the changes that Stephen talked about in society and in response to the emerging technology and consumer behaviours, including in part how COVID has changed consumer habits around food. And our existing regulatory framework doesn't really account for either of these issues. So we must act now, as the paper says. Data on online food sales is really hard to quantify. Part of the reason for this is that nobody has a clear oversight of who is selling what and where. And the constant innovation in e-commerce makes it really easy for people to set up businesses, to move between different platforms. And this results in a constantly changing picture that's difficult for us as the regulator to keep a track of. It's not unique to us, though, in the FSA, but it is something that ABC must address to protect consumers, so no matter where they purchase their food, they know that it's safe and is what it says it is. So we're linking with food regulators internationally to support the development of new approaches to e-commerce, but we're also linking directly with some of the businesses who have huge influence online. And we aim to work through some of these aggregators and marketplaces to really help signpost new businesses to our guidance at startup, to encourage new businesses to register and to make it easier for them to comply if they can access fast and simple advice. But developing relationships with industry won't be confined to those operating online. We've undertaken really significant research in the last 6 months into the business experience of regulation. And this has provided insight into the assurance mechanisms that they employ in the largest food businesses and their perceived lack of value that our current regulatory framework is adding. So this year we'll work with some of those big supermarkets to explore how we can regulate them differently at a whole business or enterprise level, signalling a move away from that traditional bricks and mortar premises-based inspection. What we're aiming to do really is to remove duplication, to increase consistency, but most of all to maintain those high levels of compliance. We'll keep a really close eye on how that progresses, but with a view to taking a similar approach to other large, highly compliant businesses in other parts of the food sector. So before I go to questions, I'd really just like to reassure the board that we're working to engage with our partners, that's with local authorities, with businesses, and to listen to consumer groups as we develop each aspect of this programme. We are still scoping a lot of the detail in the programme, as Stephen outlined, but we know that this year there are some specific things we want to do. So we're really looking for your support into continuing to seek new evidence, to analyse the evidence that we have, and to progress the priorities that we've outlined in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmel and Stephen. So I have Peter and then Mark and then Tim.
Thank you very much. That I must say this paper is encouraging in the sense that people have been getting on with this work against a very difficult background, but one where the food landscape is changing so fast that it is essential that the work is done and done at pace. In terms of the way it works across the nations of the UK, there's clearly still some work to be done in order to ensure maximum consistency where that is within the limits of possibility, of course. So far as the way that you progress that, one of the issues that the Welsh Advisory Committee raised was including a local authority from Wales in the pilot study and what your thoughts were on that. And another point was in the consumer research to include the research from Wales. And incidentally, in passing, a quick compliment, but there's now a Welsh language version of the Register of Food Business Service, and that was noted and welcomed, indicating a general attitude by the FSA of trying to ensure that it does meet the needs of each of the home nations.
Very good. Mark.
Thank you, Ruth. I think it's really good to see this programme coming back on our agenda, and I think this paper contains some really ambitious aspirations, which I'm very keen to support. If I have a reservation, though, it's around the proposal for enterprise-level regulatory approaches, and I appreciate we haven't seen the detail around that proposal yet, but the example given relates to the fact that major supermarkets are generally more compliant than the rest of the retail sector, which is great, but it's not the whole picture. And when we're looking at risk, obviously we need to look at both the likelihood of harm and the impact should that harm occur. And the sheer scale and reach of those major retailers means that the impact, should something go wrong, is likely to be much more widespread than for a single premises retailer serving a local community, for example. So in my view, legal compliance is the absolute bare minimum that we should expect from those major businesses to mitigate against the impact side of the risk equation. And ensuring that we have a robust practice and system in place to monitor continuing compliance is really important. I'd hate to see something come out of this which either removed or reduced that. I think it's also important to reflect that major players in any business segment shouldn't be allowed to have undue influence over regulatory practice and systems, whereby that influence could lead to a situation where there's either competitive advantage or competitive disadvantage to any other party. But beyond that concern, I think this paper contains some really interesting and exciting proposals for modernisation of this space, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops from here and supporting it where I am.
Thank you very much, Mark. Tim?
Thank you, Chair. And like Mark, I see this as a really exciting piece of development. It's trying to keep pace with a rapidly evolving market, and some really exciting things that we as a regulator can do with the new marketplace. But I guess there's also a little bit about steering a steady ship as well, because we've already got existing relationships and market sectors that we need to attend to. So rather like Mark's comment, I hope we don't disproportionately give focus to the big players who are often in a position to shape market, but that we keep the granularity of working with smaller scale and family-based food production businesses, which are often important economically to local communities, and that we also think about what the likely costs are to the smaller businesses as well, because what can be borne by large scale corporate businesses versus smaller businesses is often not proportionate. And we need to think quite carefully about that, because I think besides being a food regulator, we also have a wider economic responsibility to ensure that we do, and I'm going to pick up the phrase that was used in the presentation, add value back to the market. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tim. I will take Colm's comment and I'll come back to you, Carmel and Stephen.
Chair, thank you very much for that, because my comment actually links back to what both Mark and Tim have said, and it's in relation to, I suppose, if we're challenged as a regulator, and some critics may suggest that for the bigger supermarkets, this looks a little bit like self-regulation. And as a former banker, I do bear the scars of when self-regulation doesn't always work. So I suppose it's how do we ensure that if we are moving towards something that feels a bit like self-regulation, and I should preface that by saying I really like the paper, I really like the direction of travel, and I really like the picking up of the pace again. So I'm hugely supportive. My only concern is how do we manage against those sort of criticisms and accusations that may come forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Colm. So Carmel, do you want to pick up those points and questions?
Yes, thank you, Ruth, and thank you all. So, Peter, to start with you on Wales Local Authority being involved in the food standards pilots. Yes, we have a local authority on standby. We are waiting for changes to the Food Law Code of Practice. Once that's in place, we'll be able to move forward with that. So that's a real positive for us. The points that have been made by Mark and Tim and Colm on the enterprise level regulatory approach are understandable. And I think, we've outlined in the paper, this is bold and this is different. And it is something that we want to tread really carefully with, but equally that we think there is scope to do so. And the evidence is demonstrating that. So this is not about self-regulation. This is not about lowering standards. What it is about looking at the entirety of the food business, who might have several thousand premises across the country, with each of those premises being inspected through their own local authority and plan, and being able to talk to that business at an enterprise level and talk to them about the kinds of controls they have in place that might reduce some of that duplication of inspection, might increase the consistency. But everything that we do as we shape those pilots will keep to that, keeping consumers safe and not risking, I think, as Mark said, the impact if something were to go wrong. So we'll continue to shape that, and we'll continue to listen to people as we develop those pilots. Just to touch on the note as well around the proportionality with the big players and the small and medium enterprises, so those family-based businesses. We're starting this really with those big businesses where we have the evidence of really high levels of compliance, but we aren't forgetting those smaller businesses. And that whole work stream around a targeted and proportionate approach to regulation will help those businesses, those smaller businesses, to have an equal footing in that marketplace by being proportionate to their scale and their risk. So nothing is forgotten within those three work streams, but it is a very big work programme for us to work through.
Thank you, Carmel. Julie, do you want to come in?
Yes, if I could, just maybe amplifying some of the points Carmel was making there. First, in regards to the SMEs and making sure that we're not sort of applying a new disproportionate burden on SMEs. We're very aware of that. But I think now with modern digital tools that are available to them, the playing field in that regard has been levelled. The cost of such tools has dropped, and there's a much lower barrier to entry to use those sorts of tools and engage in that way. So that's not perfect, but that's under consideration. The second is around the really large businesses, particularly the big platforms, but not only them. We're talking to other government departments, particularly DCMS and the CMA, to ensure that what we look to design there is consistent with approaches being taken forward with those very big, powerful global platforms, and making sure that we're aligned with that and we're learning from their experience, and we've got a consistent approach to industry.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Emily, did you want to come in before I turn to Margaret and Colm?
Thank you. Yes, just one point to add on this small and medium enterprises point. The significance of us working on these two segments, so the big retailers and the digital platforms, is because in effect they're extremely influential over many small and medium enterprises. So the small and medium enterprises supply those platforms or those retailers often, and so I think we mustn't forget that they're getting hit from two directions. From the big retailers and their requirements, and from the local authority and their requirements. And so this isn't just about working directly with the retailers, it's also thinking about the food chain in a systemic way and thinking about how we can leverage the influence that those big companies have to achieve the outcomes for consumers that we're describing. And also in the process, ideally, make the experience of the business who's trying to do the right thing as frictionless as possible. That's absolutely the objective here. So it's not an either or here, it's a both and.
Okay, thank you. Margaret, and then Colm, we'll come back to Colm.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. And obviously I share my colleagues' thanks for this excellent paper. My points have largely been made, but this is just one tiny one. Are we what's the thinking behind the 2-star minimum FHRS rating on some online platforms? I'm not sure as a consumer I'd want to be going for 2 stars.
Okay, thank you. We'll take Colm's comment.
No, a very, very quick one, and it's just to refer the team and the agency generally, if they haven't already picked it up. There's a really good good practice guide launched yesterday by the National Audit Office on the principles of effective regulation. I just commend that to anybody. I've literally just had a quick skim through it, but it does look to be a pretty good read, and I commend that certainly to the team and anybody else in the agency.
And I think the FSA gets a couple of mentions, doesn't it, Colin?
Excellent. Right, Carmel, do you want to pick up Margaret's point?
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Margaret. So ideally, we'd like people to only be advertising through those platforms with a 3 rating or above. But this is a goodwill gesture from these platforms. They don't have to request any level of rating. What we have done is built some really good relationships with these businesses to start that process. And by utilising their leverage and their influence, what we're hoping to do is to build that over time. So 2 is a start, 3 would be even better.
Okay, thank you. And good to hear that we feature in the regulatory report. Okay, I think that's all the comments. Anybody else want to come in? No. Okay. Well, I think on the agenda we have a break. I think we'll take a 15-minute break. What time is it? We are 1 minute behind, so we'll still come back at 11:10 if that's okay with everyone. We'll see you shortly. Welcome back to the meeting, and just to conclude the Achieving Business Compliance paper, my eagerness to have a break, we just needed to round off the paper. Thank you to everyone for the comments, and just to note the board, the asks of the board for this paper are to consider the progress made, to agree to the direction of travel, which we have, to agree the work streams, and to note the 2021 delivery plan in Annex A. So thank you very much. I think the board's very keen to see progress on this work, and thank you to Carmel and Stephen for presenting the paper today. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next paper, which is the Operational Transformation Programme, the development of the future delivery model. Can I welcome Richard Wynne Davis, Head of Operational Assurance and Transformation, to the meeting, and ask Colin Sullivan, Chief Operating Officer, to open up the paper. So Colin, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ruth. And this continues the theme of regulatory reform following our earlier discussion about ABC. So the Ops Transformation Programme aims to modernise the regulatory framework for official controls in meat, dairy and the wine sectors. Those are the official controls that the FSA delivers directly as a competent authority. And our initial work is focused on the meat sector. We're seeking to make it easier for compliant businesses to maintain food safety in a transparent and cost-effective manner. Central to this program is our mission to ensure that food is safe and is what it says it is, and that animal health and welfare standards are upheld. The National Audit Office has commented in relation to the delivery of official controls that the existing regulatory system has not kept pace with technological change or the changing environment. And some elements of the industry and their representative bodies are also seeking changes. And that's evidenced, for example, in the first question that Justin read out for us at the beginning of today's meeting from Peter Hewson. Board members will recall that when making the case for change to the current delivery model last year, the board endorsed a number of guiding principles by which we should pursue operational transformation. Regrettably, the pace of change has been impacted by the pandemic, but we're returning today to discuss the first essential building block in that journey, and that is the development of a draft future delivery model. In pursuing the design of the delivery model, we have adhered to those guiding principles. which include ensuring that food safety and consumer confidence is at the heart of our reforms, looking to embrace technology where that's possible, taking a more risk-based approach and using our professional and technical resources more effectively, ensuring that there's clearer accountability in the system, and also that the delivery model demonstrates value for money for consumers, for taxpayers, and for industry, and that it supports businesses that are involved in international trade. The detailed paper in front of you today has a draft delivery model which comprises 7 elements. I'm not going to walk through each of those, you'll be pleased to know, in my introductory remarks, but I would wish to highlight a number of things. First of all, that the draft future delivery model will mean a phased move away from what is currently broadly a one-size-fits-all approach to a more tailored risk-based framework. And that could involve industry taking on direct responsibility for some routine inspection activities and the agency focusing its resources on assurance in higher risk areas. We're also seeking to work with third parties, assurance bodies and major retailers, for example, to share data and intelligence where that's appropriate to target our activities in the most effective way. The framework also involves us assessing the skills and capabilities we need and designing a recruitment and resourcing model for vets and meat hygiene inspectors that will support our approach to official control delivery going forward. And the proposed model is a framework which will enable progressive regulatory reform, with the different elements being able to be progressed in parallel, but recognizing that some will take longer than others. Some elements can be implemented within the existing legislation, and other elements will require legislative change. Our reformed approach to delivery will have implications on the underpinning charging model, and hence there is a related work stream, an enabling work stream, that will look at the implications for charging for official control services. And we do recognize if the model is fully implemented as described in the paper, we do accept that there would be some divergence in processes. That's unavoidable, at least initially, between domestic production and the production for export. And we recognize that that means that we need to be alive to that. And we're seeking to deliver this program within the context of the UK's 4-country frameworks, recognizing that the single market still applies to Northern Ireland under the protocol, and that there are different requirements of international trading partners. The program will continue to work with the agency's Achieving Business Compliance program to build a regulatory framework for the whole food chain. And finally, the model before you today is developed with input from industry and other stakeholders. But now that we have concrete proposals, we wish to engage more comprehensively. And hence we're asking for board approval to go to a period of consultation on the elements of the model and to return to the board in the autumn with refined proposals. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Colin. Richard, did you want to add anything at this point?
No, Ruth, I'm happy to help with answering questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Margaret.
Colin, and congratulations to you and your team. I think this is an exceptional paper, really good, really clear, really detailed, honest about where the complexities lie and the culture changes that are so needed, and as highlighted by the NAO. So I definitely support redressing the balance in the way that you've outlined, and I definitely support the direction of travel that you're suggesting here, because it's industry, not us, is responsible for food safety, and then we must step in behind and give light touch, give risk-based regulation, which looks for the assurance and helps the majority of companies see that where they are compliant, then that will lead to good business practice and help their businesses. I don't think that we can be relying in the future, and again, you mentioned this in the paper, on our single service provider. We need to look at that. And also the thorny issue of, while we love our long-standing staff, we need to make sure that there is legacy and we need young, experienced staff as well. And these are all difficult issues to be dealing with. So consultation definitely the way forward. I have a couple of questions. I wondered if you could, and they're around risks that you've highlighted in the paper and the annexes. I wondered if you could talk us through the risks mentioned on pages 18 to 20 of the paper around reduction in trade union engagement and in engagement between FSA colleagues due to planned organisational and role changes. I wondered why you felt there may be a risk of failure of the FSA to embrace collaborative working with highly compliant parts of the industry. And also something that Emily touched on earlier, if the cost of employing vets and luring them to work in public service work is increasing, how will it be most cost effective to have the vets in-house? What's the thinking behind that? And then just to say, I can see there's a lot of work still to be done around charging, and also who pays for new technologies to help with data collection and intelligence. Is there any chance that we will be able to get extra financial help to put in place some of these new technologies that you describe in the paper? So from outside the FSA, government, industry, etc. And then just to say that publishing food hygiene ratings has been really effective in showing how transparent we can all be, industry and us, and in improving food safety for the consumer. And I just think that publishing other data about food production could have a similar effect.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Perhaps we'll just take Peter and Colm, and then we'll go over to Richard and Colin. Peter.
There are certainly overlaps between the various papers we're having this morning, and what I welcome is that the common principles underlie each of those papers. One of the issues that has been raised in relation to earlier discussions was about charging models, and raising it specifically here, the question of how you avoid duplication in charges. Can you give a little more assurance that there won't be any duplication in charges? That was one point raised by the Welsh Advisory Committee members, and several more things that they raised. One was the interesting possibility of widening the scope of the information that is gathered so that traceability was included and the method of slaughter. Is this something that you think is feasible to include? As regards the measurement of consistency, it was pointed out that in Wales we have a higher proportion of small businesses, and that any measurement of consistency needs to take that into account. Obviously, that's a factor in England as well, but it's just the proportion, and therefore the amount of focus that will be on the small business implications. So far as the engagement with key stakeholders is concerned, a couple of bodies in Wales were particularly picked up and reporting. Could you please include the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board and also Habiki Cymru, which is Meat Promotion Wales, to provide feedback on the functionality of the model proposed. And lastly, it was suggested that discussions with farmers' markets and smaller sustainable producers would be useful and beneficial. Those are the points that I want to raise.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll take Colin. I think Tim wants to come in as well. We'll take Tim's comments as well.
Chair, thank you very much. And Colin, Richard, thank you very much for a really good and comprehensive paper. And it's a paper that I would be very supportive of in terms of the direction of travel, but not without its challenges from a four-country model perspective, as you've referenced, and particularly from a Northern Ireland perspective and the difficulties here. So I think what I would encourage is that we're very clear in terms of the consultation process, that we don't miss out on some of the unintended consequences. So we had a really good engagement at an IFAC meeting last week with input from the Northern Ireland Meat Exporters Association, and I know they have been part of some of the reference groups with you and Richard have worked over recent times. But I mean, obviously, we're still operating under EU rules, and therefore, if there is a level of divergence, do take into account the fact that the GB market accounts for about 80% of product coming from Northern Ireland. Some product actually comes from GB into Northern Ireland and then is reprocessed and goes back into GB. So there could be a difficulty in the future should some of that product come from domestic, because there are slight conflicts in the current situation with the Internal Market Bill. So we need to manage all of that as we move through the process. But I think by and large, the NIFAC were very supportive, and indeed we're NIMEA. So whenever we're going through the consultation process, let's make sure that we hit the right people, if you like, within the Northern Ireland marketplace in terms of the consumer, in terms of NIMEA, and in terms of the Livestock Meat Commission, for example, who will have particular interests around all of this. All of that said, I'm very supportive of the direction of travel. As I said at the start of the meeting today, all three papers are about transformation, and all three papers have similar challenges. So I think that we need, and I'd be just interested, similar to some of Margaret's questions, about how we address some of the risks, in terms of the open data. There is a reference there that some of the larger players in industry may be selective, let's put it that way, as to what data they wish to share. So it's how we manage all of that and how we actually manage that potential divergence. Because as we saw earlier in the meeting today, divergence between the EU and the UK is not all one way, and we will have some knowledge of any move and divergence from the UK. We need to keep our ears to the ground very much in terms of what happens in the EU, because we're not necessarily on the mailing list as we used to be. So, Emily did speak to those things that are in place there. So, just interested, just I suppose not a huge question, but about the supermarkets and how much they're prepared to share. But let's keep a very open mind, and let's be conscious of some of the issues. I suspect Northern Ireland is probably a bit more acute in terms of the challenges facing it, but we're not the only devolved nation who will have differences. So important to keep all that in mind. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Colin. We'll take Tim's comment and then we'll come back to Colin and Richard.
Thanks, Chair. Again, an excellent paper, and I'm really pleased now that we see this before us with concrete proposals. Obviously delayed under COVID, and I think we need to really push on with this. The devil's going to be in the detail. And getting the implementation right is going to have impact across the industry sector. I think we need to be very open-minded to hear back feedback as we go through implementation stages, so that we actually get it to work without it being overly bureaucratic, but also that it's effective and does exactly what Margaret was saying. I love that phrase, we come in behind with that light touch. A specific question point I have is around the assurance, particularly around the meat supply chain. In producing meat, it's not just the abattoirs. There are often 2, 3, 4 players, even in advance of that, from the original breeder. And one of the things that limits the opportunity for improving at source both health standards and indeed wider food standards around meat is the information that gets back to those primary producers. And I think we've got to play our role in making sure that through, I think it is the livestock information programme, that we specify very closely what we want so that this can become reality. And I think there's a strong need to get on with that because there are other players involved. We've all a joint interest, including DEFRA, AHDB, for example, but actually also the consumer groups that should equally be able to see that food chain information. So it should be open and transparent. And I don't see that we've indicated that at the moment, but that's something perhaps we ought to think about in the future. So my question is, are we taking steps to do this? What sort of measures do we need to take? How can we accommodate that more explicitly in the plans going forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Julie, is your hand up in response to Tim's comment?
Yes, it is. Exactly that point around the upstream data gatherings. So yes, the Livestock Information Programme, I am a member of their board, and so able to feed in at that level. And we have a number of other working relationships. We're very mindful of the opportunity of the data that they collect as that flows down, but also our responsibility with the abattoirs to feed that information back up. So we've got the relationship there. It's going to take some time to deliver that service, but I'm confident that will happen, and we will influence it. As to openness and transparency of the data, what data, is it all of it? I think that needs to have further consideration, not only upstream, which we don't own, that's a JV between DEFRA and AHDB, as well as the equivalents within the other countries. But we also need to think about data transparency downstream through the part of the system that we do own or are responsible for overseeing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. Colin.
Yes, thank you very much. And I hope I've collected all the comments. Please pick me up if I haven't. And Richard, do come in as well. But if I kick off to start with, and Margaret raised a number of issues around some of the risks that we've identified in the annexes. She highlighted the issue around the fact we have a single provider at the moment. And one of the projects within the program is looking at what is the best mode of provision going forward. We've obviously earlier in the meeting talked about the immediate pressures that we've faced post-transition, but thinking of the future and thinking beyond the current service delivery partner contract, which concludes in 2023, we have a project looking at the different models of possible delivery. And that will also have to take account of the actual future delivery model, who's actually doing some of these roles. Peter mentioned the possibility of duplication. We want to avoid duplication so that if industry is undertaking some aspects of the assurance spectrum, then we wouldn't want to be duplicating that by public sector provision, but still overseeing, of course, the process and the system. Another risk that was highlighted was the issue of whether we were engaging fully with trade union and staff. And that's absolutely central to our engagement program. We have a detailed engagement program, not just internally, but externally as well. And I'm sure Richard can say something more about that. Indeed, just to mention that we have regular field ops calls. That's with our staff on the ground in the front line. We actually have one of those this evening. So I'll be introducing that today, and I'll be highlighting where we've got to with this paper this afternoon. That's just one by way of example. I think the risk in relation to working cooperatively with those who are highly compliant, which is the majority, and it's again about trying to make sure that we make it easy for compliant businesses. The risk is that we don't use those opportunities, and we wish to do that. And it's about having mature relationships. We don't want to compromise our role as the regulator. We need to stand apart from businesses, obviously, in that respect. But we also can work constructively outside of the formal discussions around their particular compliance to have broader, wider-ranging conversations with them about the future and how things should unfold. So we want to engage with them on that basis. We have introduced an account manager scheme, an enhanced insurance initiative, as part of our engagement with some of the larger businesses, where we're able to have wider conversations, and we're also able to see some of their data. The issue about data is central to the work we're doing in terms of the segmentation model, how we would divide up the cohort of businesses, and how we would then take different approaches depending on their compliance, depending on perhaps the size and scale of the operations, perhaps also looking at the species involved and the relative risks. And Peter mentioned a number of other issues around traceability, the method of slaughter. That is currently something we're considering as part of one of the enabling streams that's mentioned in the paper. Going on then, in terms of other issues that were raised, publication of data. We currently do publish the outcomes of our veterinary audits, and we would see transparency as key to helping to drive compliance. So we'd wish to continue to do that. Indeed, we'd wish to do more of that. And in terms of the issues that Colin raised, and the importance of the four-country model and the clarity and the fact that Northern Ireland businesses are moving goods, some 80% to Great Britain, absolutely recognise that, and that is an issue that we do need to work through, because clearly Northern Ireland is in the single market. Northern Ireland is following the EU regulations. And how do we enable Northern Ireland to have access to the Great Britain market, and on what basis do they do that? Because clearly the audits of Northern Ireland businesses is through the Commission and through DG Santé, and we need to be conscious that product that is produced in Northern Ireland, if it's going to Great Britain, it needs to be ring-fenced for Great Britain and not open to the wider single market. So that is an issue. And we don't have an answer for that at present, but it is an issue that we're alive to. And clearly NIMEA will be one of the bodies that we'd be seeking to consult with. So that's a quick canter through, I think, most of the issues, but Richard, please come in.
Thanks, Colin. Just to build on a couple of points and to come back to Margaret's questions around resourcing. So the resource and capability element of the future delivery model is one where we are accelerating activity at the moment. As Colin said, we're very conscious of the resource pressures in the wider marketplace at the moment. And we're putting a project team together that will fully assess all of the opportunities that we potentially have to do things a little differently, both in terms of insourcing and outsourcing, but basically to make sure that we can secure and develop and retain the skill sets that we need across both official veterinarians and meat hygiene inspectors to ensure that we've got a more resilient and flexible model in the future. And of course, as Colin said, that's not just about resource availability, but also making sure that we are using the skills that we have to add maximum value in the right place. So making sure we've got the right people doing the right activities. Also, just to reassure on internal engagement, Colin's right. We have regular conversations with our TU colleagues, regular engagement with other parts of the FSA, particularly our field ops colleagues in terms of their engagement events. We've also set up a team of change champions that represent field ops colleagues across the front line to help to gather feedback back into the programme and take answers out there. We've got extensive Q&A documents. Clearly, field ops colleagues are very keen to understand what it means for their specific role in the plant they work in 4 or 5 years' time. And that's clearly hard to be specific at the moment, but we're helping them to understand the case for change and the direction in which we're moving to help to reassure them. I think there was a point about technology and paying for technology. Clearly, we'll be putting in a bid into SR21 for the investment that we think we need, certainly for internal systems where we can use digital tools and more efficient ways of working to make us a more effective and efficient operation. But clearly also we'll be looking to food business operators to invest in technology as well, but also understanding that there's a difference between large FBOs and small FBOs in terms of their ability to invest in technology. And we'll clearly take that into account to make sure that smaller businesses aren't disproportionately impacted. Peter, thank you for the additional stakeholders that we need to involve. And of course, the list in the paper is not exhaustive, and we're more than happy to involve additional stakeholders, and that applies to the rest of the board. If there's anybody else that you think we should be talking to that we're potentially not, they're more than happy to pick that up. And I think that covers everything, Colin. I can't think of anything else.
Okay, Colin, we'll come back to you and then Emily will come in.
Thanks very much. I put my hand up because I can't read my own writing. Apologies. And I omitted to mention the technology issue, but you've covered that, Richard. Yes, I think the technology issue is an interesting one because clearly we will put a bid in for SR21 and we'll see what, and we'll have identified through our business case what the resources that we think we need. But also we're encouraging industry, if they invest in technical solutions in their plants, can we take account of that, the information that they can glean from that technology as a proxy for alternative means of inspection. So it's really about that, how we do that we need to test some of those proof of concepts. And I think that plays into some of the longer term work that, for example, the 21st century abattoir research is being undertaken at present and will play into that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Emily?
Thank you. Colin and Richard have answered most of the questions extremely well. I just wanted to add one point in response to something Margaret said, which was, I think you said, Margaret, in-house vets will be more expensive. I just want to be really clear, we haven't yet made a decision about whether we will outsource or insource in the future. Insourcing or some insourcing is on the table as an option, and we'll be looking at, we'll be doing a very clear business case, thinking through different approaches. The first step we need to do is work out how much vet resource we're going to need for the sorts of activities we predict. And so this operating model is the first step towards that. When we come to that consideration, we will look at both the cost, potential cost, and the value. You know, we'll follow the appropriate Treasury guidelines on how to assess that. And a lot of things will be considered. I mean, certainly last time when we did the business case, it proved cheaper to outsource, and that's why we went with the solution that we did. But we want to consider a number of different factors. So I just want to be really clear about where we were in that process. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Do any board members want to come back on any of the responses? Any further points? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. I think the general feeling is that we really welcome seeing these proposals and welcome the paper, but recognise it's a complex change programme and we've discussed some of the risks going forward. So the board is asked to note the future delivery model proposal, which we have done, endorse the key elements of the draft model and progression to external consultation, and acknowledge the key delivery and cultural change challenges associated with the draft model. And it's very clear that we can now, the board agrees, go forward to consultation, wider discussion to help inform the way forward, using this as the basis for that consultation. So well done on the progress so far. And we look forward to hearing a bit more later in the year about how this programme will develop further. So thank you, Colin and Richard, for the work you've done today. Thank you. Right, so we'll now move on to the next item, which is reports from the chairs of the food advisory committees. And we'll invite Colin first to present the report from NIFAC.
Sure, thank you very much, and I will be as brief as possible. It's been quite a busy period for NIFAC since the last board meeting. We have taken on 3 new board members. Ellen Finlay, who brings a background from food poverty and nutrition, Cathal MacDonald from the food industry, and Dr. Lynn McMullen from education, with a very clear focus on food and nutrition. So 3 great additions to NIFAC. We had an open meeting on the 20th of April where we considered the Food and News Survey with Lucy King and Beth Armstrong from the Social Science team, and Michelle Sherlow, who's the Chief Executive of Food NI, who spoke to us and gave us an update on where the industry generally is in the big challenges, if you like, so COVID, Brexit, and the Northern Ireland Protocol. So she had a really, really good discussion. And we were joined by our Chief Executive, Emily, and I'm delighted to say that, as far as I know, that was the first time we had a Chief Executive at an IFAC meeting. So hopefully not too long before you're back, Emily. We met again on the 21st of May, just last Friday, to consider the board papers in a closed session, but we did invite along representatives from the Northern Ireland Food Managers Group, from 2 local authorities, and from the Northern Ireland Beef Exporters Association to help our deliberations. We have a planned closed session on the 9th of June, just ahead of the next board meeting, to consider the board papers, and our next open meeting is planned for the 23rd of June, where we will consider food hypersensitivity from a Northern Ireland perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colm. Any questions to Colm? No? Okay, thank you. Peter, over to you.
We also have some new members of the Welsh Committee, but they on the 1st of April, and I think I've already reported on that to the board. We've held meetings in April and also last Wednesday when we considered these 4 papers. And we should be meeting again in a couple of weeks' time. And like Northern Ireland, we'll be looking at hypersensitivity, but also quite a long agenda of papers that are then going to be considered at the next board meeting. So quite a bit going on, reflecting really the pace of what's happening at the board level. And I think I've reported on most of the results of the meetings in considering the papers earlier on. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter. Any questions to Peter? Thank you. As you rightly say, a very busy time, lots of material to consider, and thank you to both committees for your very valued contributions to the work of the FSA. So we're on to any other business. We weren't notified of any other business, so I think unless anybody wants to raise anything, that concludes the meeting today. Thank you very much for your attendance. And just to confirm that the next meeting of the FSA Board and Business Committee will take place at 9 a.m, the earliest start, via Zoom on the 16th of June. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth.